The blood-curdling roar split the peaceful forest air, freezing Fiona Vaughn in her tracks as she clutched her basket of wild blackberries. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a frantic prisoner seeking escape. Time stretched impossibly thin as the massive grizzly bear, standing over 8 feet tall on its hind legs, charged toward her through the sun-dappled woods outside Wood River, Nebraska. The year was 1874, and Fiona had never imagined that her morning berry-picking expedition would end in a deadly confrontation. Her blue calico dress fluttered in the summer breeze as she stumbled backward, knowing with terrible certainty that she could never outrun the enraged beast. The thundering of hooves barely registered in her terror-stricken mind, until a man on horseback burst through the trees, leaping from his mount between Fiona and the charging bear. His broad shoulders blocked her view as he crouched defensively, the sunlight glinting off the blade of a large hunting knife in his steady hand. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice calm despite the mortal danger before them. The bear roared again, saliva dripping from yellowed fangs as it hesitated momentarily at this new threat. The man, a cowboy judging by his worn leather chaps and dusty hat, stood his ground, knife extended before him. "Back away slow," he instructed Fiona without taking his eyes off the bear. "Don't run." Fiona couldn't have run if she'd wanted to. Her limbs felt leaden with fear. The cowboy shifted slightly, keeping himself between her and certain death. The bear charged again, and the cowboy moved with surprising agility for such a solidly built man. He slashed with the knife, catching the bear across its sensitive nose. The animal reared back, swiping massive paws through the air, missing the cowboy's face by inches. Blood pounded in Fiona's ears as she watched the deadly dance unfold. The cowboy circled, never giving ground, slashing precisely when the bear lunged. His movements were practiced, deliberate. He had done this before. After what seemed an eternity, the bear finally dropped to all fours, huffing angrily before turning and lumbering away into the underbrush, deciding this prey wasn't worth the fight. Only when the sounds of crashing foliage faded did Fiona release the breath she'd been holding. The cowboy turned toward her, sheathing his knife in one fluid motion. His face, shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, now came into full view. Strong jawline covered with several days' stubble, intense green eyes that seemed to look straight through her, and a small scar cutting through his right eyebrow. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice gentler now that the danger had passed. "No," Fiona managed, her voice barely a whisper. "No, thanks to you. You saved my life, Mr. Xavier," he replied, removing his hat and revealing sun-lightened brown hair. "Xavier Jameson." "Fiona Vaughn," she said, extending a trembling hand. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Jameson." His large, calloused hand enveloped hers, warm and steady. "No need for thanks. Couldn't leave a lady to face a grizzly alone." He glanced at her scattered berries. "Though these woods aren't safe for berry picking, especially alone. I've lived in Wood River my whole life and never encountered a bear before," she countered, some of her composure returning. Xavier's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "First time for everything, Miss Vaughn." He helped her gather what remained of her berries, then offered her a ride back to town on his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion. Fiona hesitated only briefly before accepting, aware of how her father would disapprove of her riding with a strange man. But circumstances were extraordinary, and she couldn't face walking back through those woods alone. As they rode, Fiona seated side saddle in front of Xavier, she learned he was passing through on his way to Wyoming, having spent the last 5 years working cattle drives up from Texas. There was something about him, a quiet strength, an air of having seen too much that intrigued her more than any of the local boys ever had. Wood River came into view, a small but growing settlement that had sprouted up alongside the railroad. Xavier brought his horse to a stop at the edge of town. "Which way to your home, Miss Vaughn?" he asked politely. "The white house with blue shutters just past the general store," she directed, pointing down the main street. As they approached, Fiona's father burst through the front door, his face a storm of concern and anger. "Fiona Elizabeth Vaughn, where have you?" His words died as he took in the sight of his daughter perched before a stranger on horseback. "Who is this man?" Fiona dismounted with Xavier's help. "Papa, this is Mr. Xavier Jameson. He saved my life today. There was a bear in the north woods. It charged at me, and Mr. Jameson stepped between us with nothing but a knife." George Vaughn's expression shifted from anger to astonishment, then to cautious gratitude. "Is this true, sir?" Xavier nodded once, replacing his hat. "Yes, sir." "Your daughter handled herself admirably under the circumstances. Then it seems we owe you a debt, Mr. Jameson." George extended his hand, which Xavier shook firmly. "Will you join us for supper? It's the least we can offer." Fiona held her breath, hoping he would accept. There was something about this mysterious cowboy that made her want to know more. When Xavier glanced at her before nodding his agreement, a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "I'd be honored, Mr. Vaughn." That evening, Fiona learned that Xavier had fought in the war between the states, despite being barely 18 when it ended, had driven cattle through Indian territory, and had once tracked a mountain lion for 3 days after it had killed a rancher's child. He spoke little of himself, answering questions directly but never elaborating, yet every word revealed a man who lived by a strict code of honor. "Will you be staying in Wood River long, Mr. Jameson?" Fiona's mother, Elizabeth, asked as she served apple pie. "No, madam. Just passing through. I've taken a job at a ranch near Cheyenne." Fiona felt a pang of disappointment. One evening was hardly enough time to know someone who had saved your life. "Well," George said thoughtfully, "the stage to Cheyenne doesn't leave until Tuesday. That's 3 days from now. Perhaps you'd allow me to repay your kindness by offering you lodging until then. The hotel in town isn't fit for a dog, and we have a spare room." Fiona's heart leapt, though she kept her expression composed as a proper young lady should. Xavier hesitated. "That's very generous, sir, but I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Elizabeth insisted. "You saved our only daughter. You're welcome here." And so it was decided. Xavier would stay with the Vaughns until the stage departed. As Fiona showed him to the small guest room that night, their hands brushed accidentally, sending an unexpected jolt through her fingers. "Thank you again," she said softly. "Not everyone would have done what you did today." Xavier looked at her with those intense green eyes. "Get some rest, Miss Vaughn. You've had quite a shock today." "Fiona," she corrected. "Please call me Fiona." He nodded once. "Good night, Fiona." "Good night, Xavier." As she lay in bed that night, Fiona replayed the day's events. The bear, the fear, the extraordinary courage of a man who'd placed himself between her and death. She'd heard stories of cowboys, rough men who lived hard lives on the trail, but Xavier Jameson defied those stereotypes with his quiet dignity and gentle manners. For the first time in her 22 years, Fiona felt the stirring of something beyond the comfortable familiarity of Wood River life. Something that whispered of adventure and possibility, of a world beyond the small Nebraska town, where she'd spent her entire life teaching at the schoolhouse and helping at her father's mercantile store. Little did she know that the next 3 days would change everything. The following morning, Fiona rose early as was her habit. To her surprise, Xavier was already awake, sitting on the back porch watching the sun rise over the distant hills. She paused in the doorway, taking in his profile, strong and weathered by years under the open sky. "Coffee," she offered, holding out a steaming cup. He accepted with a nod of thanks. "You're up early." "I could say the same for you," she replied, settling on the porch step beside him. "Don't cowboys usually sleep till noon after gambling and carousing all night?" A brief smile touched his lips. "Those are the ones who don't last long on the trail, Miss Fiona. Hard work doesn't allow for late mornings." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the town gradually stirred to life. Shopkeepers opened their doors, women hung laundry on lines, children began their morning chores. "It seems peaceful," Xavier observed. "It is mostly. Though we have our share of troubles like anywhere." She glanced at him. "What made you choose this life? Always moving, never settling." Xavier considered her question, taking a long sip of coffee before answering. "After the war, home didn't feel like home anymore. Too many ghosts." His voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. "The open country has a way of clearing a man's head." Fiona wanted to ask more about the war, about the ghosts he mentioned, but sensed his reluctance to elaborate. "Instead," she said, "my father could use some help at the store today if you're willing. Our stock boy broke his leg last week. I'd be glad to help." Working alongside Xavier at her father's general store proved illuminating. He had a surprising head for figures, totaling complex orders without paper. He was unfailingly polite to customers, especially the elderly widows who came in just to gawk at the handsome stranger. And when the Wilkins brothers, notorious troublemakers, came in looking to start something with the newcomer, his calm stare alone was enough to send them backing out the door. "You've got quite a way about you," George commented as they closed up shop that evening. "Ever considered settling down somewhere? A man with your abilities could do well in business." Xavier shrugged. "Never found a reason to stay in one place, sir." His eyes briefly met Fiona's across the counter, and she felt a flush rise to her cheeks. That evening, after supper, Xavier joined Fiona for a walk through town. Wood River wasn't large, just a few streets of buildings, the railroad station, and scattered houses, but Fiona proudly showed him the schoolhouse where she taught, the small church, and finally, the bridge over the actual Wood River that gave the town its name. "It's not much compared to what you've seen," she said apologetically as they leaned against the bridge railing, watching the water flow beneath them. "There's beauty in simplicity," Xavier replied. "I've seen grand cities and wild country, but there's something to be said for a place where people know each other, where they build something lasting together." The setting sun cast golden light across his features, softening them. For a moment, Fiona could glimpse the young man he must have been before the war, before the hard years that followed. "Tell me about Wyoming," she said. "What waits for you there? A job, good pay, open country?" He turned to face her. "What waits for you here, Fiona Vaughn?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean? You're educated, intelligent, beautiful. This town seems small for someone like you, beautiful." The word lingered in her mind like a forbidden sweetmeat. "This is my home," she said simply. "My parents need me. My students need me." "And what do you need?" No one had ever asked her that before. Not her parents, not the local boys who occasionally came calling, certainly not Henry Blackwell, the banker's son who had been trying to court her for months. Before she could answer, shouts erupted from down the street. A crowd was gathering outside the saloon. Xavier instinctively moved closer to Fiona as they approached to investigate. A man lay sprawled in the dirt, blood streaming from his nose. Above him stood a burly figure, fists clenched. "That's Bruce Wilkins," Fiona whispered. "One of the brothers from the store today." Bruce was shouting at the prone man. You cheated me, Peterson. Nobody cheats a Wilkins. The sheriff emerged from his office across the street. That's enough, Bruce. Back away now. Bruce spat on the ground near Peterson. This ain't over. His gaze swept the crowd and locked onto Xavier. Well, look who's here, the fancy cowboy. His eyes narrowed. I know you from somewhere. Xavier's expression remained impassive. I don't believe so. Bruce took a menacing step forward. No, I reckon I do. Kansas City 2 years back. You're the one who took down my cousin Dale. Fiona felt Xavier tense beside her. Your cousin drew first, he said quietly. The judge called it self-defense. A chill ran through Fiona. The conversation had suddenly veered into dangerous territory. Bruce's face twisted with rage. Dale was family, and Wilkins, don't forget. The sheriff stepped between them. I said that's enough. Bruce, go sleep it off. And you, stranger, he's staying with us, Sheriff, Fiona interjected. Mr. Jameson saved my life yesterday from a bear attack in the North Woods. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. Is that so? Well then, Mr. Jameson, I suggest you steer clear of the Wilkins boys during your stay. They've got more meanness than sense, especially when liquored up. Xavier nodded curtly. Understood, Sheriff. As they walked back to the Vaughn home, Fiona's mind whirled with questions. Kansas City, she finally asked. Xavier sighed. It was a fair fight. I was having dinner when this man, Dale apparently, recognized me from a dispute over cattle the year before. He drew his gun, I was faster. You've killed men, she said softly. It wasn't a question. He stopped walking, turning to her with an expression both solemn and defensive. Yes, in war and after when I had no choice. I don't take pride in it, Fiona. She studied his face in the twilight, seeing the regret etched there. I believe you, she said finally. And she did. Whatever Xavier Jameson had done, she sensed it had always been according to his own strict moral code. They continued walking in silence, the revelation hanging between them like a veil. Yet strangely, Fiona didn't feel afraid of him. If anything, she felt more drawn to the complexity of this man who had seen so much darkness, yet still stepped between a woman and a bear without hesitation. When they reached her porch, Xavier cleared his throat. Perhaps it's best if I move to the hotel tomorrow. I wouldn't want to bring trouble to your family. No, Fiona said firmly. The Wilkins are all talk. Besides, that hotel is truly dreadful. My father would never forgive me if I let you stay there after what you did for me. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that they were heading into uncharted territory, drawn to each other despite the obvious impediments of his transient lifestyle and her rooted existence. One more day, then, he conceded. That night, Fiona dreamed of bears and brave men with knives, of open prairies and distant mountains. She woke before dawn with a restlessness in her soul that no amount of rational thinking could quell. Sunday in Wood River meant church, and Xavier surprised Fiona by agreeing to attend with the family. He cleaned up impressively, borrowing a jacket from George that was slightly too short in the sleeves but otherwise presentable. His hair, usually hidden beneath his hat, was neatly combed, revealing streaks of gold among the brown. Heads turned as they walked down the aisle to the Vaughn family's usual pew. Whispers followed them about the bear attack, about Xavier's intervention, and undoubtedly, after last night's confrontation, about his history. Henry Blackwell, sitting with his parents across the aisle, stared openly at Xavier before giving Fiona a wounded look. She felt a twinge of guilt. Henry was a decent man, boring, perhaps, but stable and kind. The sort of man her parents hoped she would eventually marry. Yet sitting beside Xavier, feeling the solid warmth of his arm occasionally brushing against hers, Henry seemed as substantial as a shadow. After the service, As congregants gathered on the church lawn, Reverend Tolliver approached them. "Miss Vaughn, I understand you had quite an adventure yesterday," the white-haired minister said. "God must have sent this young man to your aid at precisely the right moment." "Yes, Reverend, I believe he did," Fiona replied, smiling up at Xavier. "And you, Mr. Jameson, what brings you to our little town?" "Just passing through, sir, on my way to Wyoming." The Reverend nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the Lord's plan includes detours we never anticipated." "Will you be staying long?" "The stage leaves tomorrow," Xavier answered. Fiona felt her stomach tighten at the reminder of his imminent departure. One more day. Just one more day to know this man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. "Well, we're grateful for your protection of one of our flock," Reverend Tolliver said warmly. "You're welcome in our church any time your travels bring you back this way." As they mingled with the congregation, Fiona introduced Xavier to her friends and neighbors. Most were welcoming, though some regarded him with suspicion, the natural wariness small towns hold for strangers, especially ones with mysterious pasts. Henry eventually made his way to them, extending a hand to Xavier with forced politeness. "Mr. Jameson, I understand we owe you a debt for Miss Vaughn's safety." "No debt," Xavier replied evenly. "Anyone would have done the same." "I'm not sure that's true," Henry said, a edge to his voice. "Not everyone carries a knife or knows how to use it against a bear." Before the conversation could turn more awkward, Fiona's mother called them over for the Sunday picnic on the church grounds. As they ate chicken and biscuits under the shade of a large oak tree, Fiona became acutely aware of how naturally Xavier fit with her family. Her father engaged him in discussions about business prospects in Wyoming. Her mother fussed over whether he had enough food. Even her 10-year-old brother, Matthew, had taken to him, begging for stories of his adventures. When the meal was finished, families began dispersing to their Sunday afternoon activities. As the Vaughns prepared to leave, Sheriff Miller approached their blanket. "Mr. Jameson, might I have a word?" he asked, his expression serious. Xavier nodded, stepping away with the lawman. Fiona watched them converse, anxiety building as the sheriff's gestures became more animated. When Xavier returned, his face was grim. "What is it?" she asked as they walked home. "The Wilkins brothers were making threats at the saloon this morning. The sheriff thinks they might be planning something before I leave town," George overheard. "Those boys have been trouble since they could walk. Their father was no better." "I should leave today," Xavier said firmly. "Take the evening train to Grand Island and catch the stage from there." "Nonsense," George replied. "We won't let those hooligans run you out of town. Sheriff Miller can handle them." But Fiona noticed how Xavier's hand occasionally drifted toward his side, where his knife would normally be sheathed, and how his eyes continuously scanned their surroundings as they walked home. The carefree quality of the previous day had vanished, replaced by a vigilance that spoke of hard-learned lessons. Back at the house, Xavier excused himself to check on his horse at the livery stable. Despite her parents' concerned looks, Fiona followed him. "I'll walk with you," she said, falling into step beside him. "Not a good idea," he responded, his voice low. "The Wilkins brothers have no love for you either after you spoke up to the sheriff." "This is my town, Xavier. I won't be intimidated in it." He glanced at her, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "You're braver than most men I've known." They walked in silence for a few moments before Fiona gathered her courage. "Will you write? After you reach Wyoming?" Xavier's step faltered almost imperceptibly. "Fiona, I know it's forward of me to ask," she hurried on. "We've barely known each other 2 days, but I would like to know you're safe, at least." They reached the livery stable, deserted on a Sunday afternoon except for the dozing stable boy. Xavier checked his stallion carefully, running his hands along its legs, examining the feed. "I'm not good at writing letters," he said finally, his back to her as he adjusted the horse's blanket. "And I'm not sure it would be wise." "Why not?" He turned to face her then, his expression troubled. "Because letters lead to expectations. Expectations I'm not sure I can fulfill." "I'm not asking for promises," Fiona said, stepping closer. "Just connection." Xavier's gaze held hers, and she could see the conflict there, a man accustomed to leaving, suddenly finding it difficult to contemplate the departure. "One letter," he conceded. "When I reach Cheyenne." Fiona smiled, trying to hide her disappointment that he wouldn't commit to more. "I look forward to it." As they exited the stable, the Wilkins brothers emerged from the alleyway across the street. Bruce, the largest, flanked by his brothers Amos and Clyde. All three had the rangy, underfed look of men who lived by their wits rather than honest work. Xavier immediately positioned himself in front of Fiona. "Go back inside the stable," he ordered quietly. "No," she replied, standing her ground beside him. "This is my town." Bruce spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dirt street. "Well, ain't this cozy?" "The schoolmarm and the killer out for a Sunday stroll. We want no trouble," Xavier said evenly. "I'm leaving town tomorrow." "That's one day too many," Amos sneered. "Our cousin's been dead 2 years because of you." Fiona felt her temper flare. "Your cousin tried to shoot an unarmed man, from what I hear." Clyde, the youngest brother, gave a nasty laugh. "Listen to her. Got yourself a real spitfire, Jameson." "The lady speaks true," came a new voice. Henry Blackwell stepped from the general store doorway, surprisingly steady despite the fear evident in his face. "I suggest you boys move along before Sheriff Miller gets wind of this." Bruce laughed. "Look, boys, the banker's son is playing hero." He took a menacing step forward. "This ain't your business, Blackwell." "Miss Vaughn's safety is my business," Henry replied, his voice only slightly shaky. "And the sheriff is already aware of your threats against Mr. Jameson." Xavier hadn't moved, his eyes never leaving Bruce's face. 5 against 3, he said quietly. "Not odds I'd take if I were you, Wilkins." 5, Bruce scoffed. "I count 2 men and a woman." "And 2 shotguns," came George Vaughn's stern voice as he and Sheriff Miller approached from down the street, each carrying a shotgun. "Step away from my daughter and our guest, Bruce." The standoff held for several tense heartbeats before Bruce spat again. "This ain't over," he growled, but he and his brothers backed away, disappearing around the corner. Sheriff Miller shook his head. "I'll keep an eye on them until you're gone, Jameson, but watch yourself." "Always do, Sheriff." Xavier turned to Henry, extending his hand. "Thank you." Henry shook it grudgingly. "I did it for Miss Vaughn." The rest of the day passed without incident, though Xavier remained vigilant. After supper, the family gathered in the parlor as was their Sunday custom. Elizabeth played hymns on the piano, while Matthew recounted stories from his Sunday school lesson. It was a scene of such domestic tranquility that Fiona found herself watching Xavier's reactions, wondering how long it had been since he'd experienced such simple family pleasures. As the evening wound down, George announced he was turning in. "Big day tomorrow with the stage coming," he said, glancing at Xavier. "We'll miss your help at the store." After her parents retired, Fiona lingered in the parlor with Xavier. Matthew had already been sent to bed, leaving them alone with just the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional pop from the fireplace. "Will you miss it?" she asked suddenly. "Stability, family, a place to belong." Xavier looked into the dying embers. "Can't miss what you've never really had. You had it once, before the war," he nodded slowly. "A lifetime ago, my parents' farm in Missouri, it was burnt during the fighting. They didn't survive." Fiona's heart ached for him. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Is that why you keep moving? Because there's nothing to go back to, Xavier considered her question. Partly, and partly because standing still means facing things I'd rather outrun. The ghosts you mentioned, among other things. He turned to her, his expression softening. You've built something good here, Fiona. Your family, your students, your place in this community. Don't take it for granted. I don't, she replied. But sometimes I wonder if there's more, if I'm meant for something beyond Wood River. Their eyes met, and Fiona felt the weight of everything unsaid between them, the connection that had formed so quickly, the impossibility of pursuing it with his departure looming. I should turn in, Xavier said finally, standing. Early start tomorrow. Fiona rose too, suddenly unwilling to let the evening end. Will you show me your knife? The one you used against the bear. I never got a good look at it. Xavier seemed surprised by the request but withdrew the knife from the sheath at his belt. It was larger than a typical hunting knife, with a blade about 10 inches long. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, the blade meticulously maintained. It was my father's, he explained, turning it so the firelight glinted off the steel. One of the few things I have left of him. Fiona reached out tentatively. May I? He hesitated before placing it carefully in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, the balance perfect. He would have used it the same way you did, she said softly, to protect someone who needed protecting. Xavier's fingers brushed hers as he reclaimed the knife, sending that now familiar warmth through her. You should get some rest too, he said, his voice husky. Good night, Xavier. Good night, Fiona. She ascended the stairs, pausing at the landing to look back at him. He stood by the fire, silhouetted against the glow, a solitary figure accustomed to his solitude. In that moment, Fiona knew with startling clarity that she was falling in love with Xavier Jameson, and that by this time tomorrow he would be gone from her life. Morning arrived with a melancholy gray light filtering through rain clouds. Fiona dressed carefully in her blue calico dress, the same one she'd worn when Xavier saved her from the bear, and pinned her hair with extra attention. If this was to be goodbye, she wanted to leave him with a memory worth keeping. Downstairs, the atmosphere was subdued. Elizabeth had prepared a hearty breakfast, and George discussed the weather and business prospects in Wyoming, everything, except the imminent departure that weighed on them all. Even Matthew was unusually quiet, having grown attached to Xavier's occasional stories of life on the trail. The stage was scheduled to arrive at noon. As the clock ticked toward the hour, Xavier gathered his few possessions and settled his bill at the livery stable. Fiona accompanied him on these errands, memorizing the way he moved, the sound of his voice, the rare smile that transformed his solemn features. Will you think of Wood River sometimes? She asked as they walked toward the stage station. I'll think of it, he replied, then more softly. Of you. The admission hung between them, pregnant with possibilities neither dared explore. The station master called out, "Stage approaching." People gathered to watch a common enough entertainment in a small town. Fiona spotted Henry Blackwell standing with his father, watching her with an expression of resigned understanding. The Wilkins brothers were nowhere to be seen, to her relief. The stagecoach thundered into town, horses lathered from the pace, dust billowing around the wheels. It came to a stop before the station, and the driver called down, 10 minutes, folks, Cheyenne bound." Xavier turned to George and Elizabeth. "Thank you for your hospitality, I won't forget it." Elizabeth embraced him quickly. "You're welcome in our home any time you're passing through, Mr. Jameson." George shook his hand firmly. "Take care of yourself, son." Matthew received a tousle of his hair and a quiet word that made the boy stand straighter pridefully. Then Xavier turned to Fiona. "Miss Vaughn." Mr. Jameson, she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. He took her hand, holding it perhaps a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. Thank you for reminding me of what a home can be. Thank you for saving my life, she whispered. The driver called, all aboard. Xavier released her hand and picked up his saddlebag. The stallion had been loaded into a stock car on the previous day's train, arranged by George as a parting gift. Just as Xavier turned toward the stage, a shot rang out. People screamed, dropping to the ground or running for cover. Fiona felt Xavier's arm encircle her waist, pulling her behind the water trough as more shots splintered the wood around them. "Wilkins," Sheriff Miller shouted from the doorway of his office. "Drop those guns!" More shots answered him. Xavier's expression hardened as he peered over the trough. The brothers, on the roof of the saloon. George had pulled Elizabeth and Matthew to safety behind a freight wagon. Other townspeople cowered wherever they could find shelter. "Stay here," Xavier ordered Fiona. "What are you going to do?" But he was already moving, keeping low, making his way around the back of the buildings. Fiona's heart hammered with fear not for herself, but for him. Sheriff Miller exchanged fire with the Wilkins brothers, but they had the advantage of height. A bullet struck the lawman's shoulder, spinning him back against the doorframe. Long minutes passed in terrifying stalemate, shots occasionally breaking the tense silence. Then Fiona saw movement on the roof of the saloon. Xavier had somehow made his way up there. She watched in horror as he engaged Bruce in hand-to-hand combat, the two men struggling dangerously close to the edge. Amos turned his gun toward them, but hesitated, unable to get a clear shot at Xavier without risking his brother. Clyde maintained fire on the street below, keeping potential rescuers pinned down. Bruce was bigger, but Xavier was quicker and clearly more experienced in close fighting. He managed to disarm the larger man, sending Bruce's revolver skittering across the roof. In desperation, Bruce pulled a knife, slashing wildly. Xavier ducked the first swing but caught the second across his arm, tearing his shirt and drawing blood. He staggered back, too close to the edge. Bruce charged forward with a roar. With a movement almost too fast to follow, Xavier sidestepped, using Bruce's momentum against him. The big man couldn't stop his forward rush and plummeted over the edge of the roof, landing with a sickening thud on the street below. Amos screamed in rage, firing at Xavier, who dove behind a chimney. Clyde, distracted by his brother's fall, presented an opportunity that Henry Blackwell seized. The banker's son emerged from cover long enough to fire his father's derringer, striking Clyde in the shoulder. The youngest Wilkins brother dropped his weapon, clutching his wound. In the confusion, Xavier emerged from behind the chimney and tackled Amos, disarming him after a brief struggle. It was over. Townspeople cautiously emerged from hiding. Sheriff Miller, despite his wound, took charge of the Wilkins brothers. Bruce had survived his fall with a broken leg and arm. All three were bound for jail and eventually, trial. Xavier climbed down from the roof, his left arm bleeding but otherwise unharmed. Fiona ran to him, propriety forgotten in the aftermath of violence. "You're hurt," she said, examining the wound. "It's nothing serious," he assured her, though he winced when she touched near the cut. The stagecoach driver approached them. "That was something to see, mister, but we're already behind schedule. Are you coming or staying?" Xavier looked at the waiting coach, then at Fiona, indecision clear in his eyes. "You should have that arm properly tended," she said softly. "The next stage comes through in 3 days." It wasn't a plea for him to stay, not exactly, but it offered a reason, a justification. 3 days, Xavier repeated thoughtfully. Then, to the driver, "I'll catch the next one." The coach departed without him, leaving Xavier standing in the street with Fiona, her father watching thoughtfully from a distance. Dr. Pearson stitched Xavier's arm in his office, declaring it a clean wound that should heal nicely. Throughout the procedure, Fiona stayed by his side, assisting the doctor and providing distraction with light conversation. "That was quite a performance," she said as they walked back to her home afterward. "You've done that sort of thing before?" Xavier nodded. "More times than I care to remember." "Is that the life waiting for you in Wyoming? More violence?" He considered the question. "I took the job because it's what I know. Cattle, horses, occasional trouble, but lately—" He trailed off. "Lately what?" Xavier stopped walking, turning to face her. "Lately I've been wondering if there might be more, something beyond the next horizon." The honesty in his voice made Fiona bold. "Could that something be here?" "In Wood River." His eyes searched hers. "Would you want it to be?" Before she could answer, her father's voice called from their porch. "Fiona!" "Xavier!" Come in out of the rain. Indeed, the threatening clouds had finally opened, fat droplets beginning to pelt them. They hurried toward the house, the moment interrupted but not forgotten. That evening, after supper, George invited Xavier into his study, a small room lined with books that served as the heart of the Vaughn home. Fiona tried not to fret about their conversation, keeping herself busy helping her mother with mending. When Xavier emerged an hour later, his expression was thoughtful but revealed nothing. He excused himself early, citing his injury, but his eyes lingered on Fiona as he bid the family good night. Elizabeth waited until his footsteps faded upstairs before turning to her daughter. "That man cares for you, Fiona. Anyone with eyes can see it." Fiona's cheeks warmed. "We've known each other 4 days, Mother." "Sometimes that's all it takes," Elizabeth replied with a knowing smile. "Your father asked me to marry him after 2 weeks' acquaintance, when it's right, you know. But Xavier has a job waiting in Wyoming, a life that has no place for entanglements." Elizabeth set down her sewing. "Men like Xavier Jameson don't change direction easily, but when they do, it's with their whole heart." She paused. "Your father has offered him a partnership in the store." Fiona's head snapped up. "He what?" "George has been looking to expand, open a second location in Grand Island. He needs someone with a good head for business and the strength to handle the rougher elements. After seeing Xavier these past days, he believes he's found that person." Hope fluttered in Fiona's chest. What did Xavier say? That he needed to think about it. Elizabeth patted her daughter's hand. "Give him time, dear. Some men need to come to decisions in their own way." The next morning, Xavier was gone. His room was empty, bed neatly made, saddlebag missing. Fiona felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "His horse is gone too," Matthew reported after running to check the stable. "Did he leave without saying goodbye?" Elizabeth found a note on the kitchen table, addressed to George. Her husband read it silently, then passed it to Fiona. "Mr. Vaughn," it read, "I appreciate your generous offer more than I can express. Before I can give you an answer, there's something I must do. I'll return before the stage departs tomorrow. Respectfully, X. Jameson." Relief washed over Fiona, though confusion quickly followed. "Where could he have gone?" George shook his head. "That's his business, but I believe he'll be back as promised." The day passed with excruciating slowness. Fiona went through the motions of her normal routine, helping at the store, visiting a former student who was ill, attending the Ladies' Aid Society meeting, but her mind constantly wandered to Xavier. What errand was so important that he'd left without a word to her? As evening approached with no sign of his return, anxiety began to gnaw at her. What if he'd simply used the note as a kind way to depart without an awkward goodbye? What if he never intended to return? She was sitting on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in fiery hues, when she heard hoofbeats. Xavier's chestnut stallion appeared at the end of the street, its rider silhouetted against the dying light. Fiona stood, her heart racing as Xavier approached. He dismounted in one fluid motion, securing the horse to the hitching post before climbing the porch steps. "You came back," she said simply. "I said I would." He removed his hat, revealing hair damp with sweat from hard riding. "May I sit?" They settled side by side on the porch swing, the gentle creaking of its chains the only sound for several moments. "Where did you go?" Fiona finally asked. "North Woods." Xavier reached into his saddlebag and withdrew something wrapped in oilcloth. "I went back to where we met." He unwrapped the package carefully, revealing the massive paw of a grizzly bear, the claws nearly 4 inches long. Fiona gasped. "Is that—" "The same bear, yes. I tracked him all day." Xavier rewrapped the paw. "Among my people, my mother was half Pawnee, a warrior who defeats a powerful enemy gains some of its strength. This bear was the reason we met. Seemed fitting to settle accounts with him before making any decisions about the future." "You killed it?" Fiona asked, not sure how she felt about that. Xavier nodded. "It would have attacked again. Maybe a child next time." He paused. "I've been running a long time, Fiona. From the war, from my past, from settling anywhere that might start to feel like home. But standing in those woods again, I realized something." "What?" "That I'm tired of running. That maybe what I've been looking for isn't over the next ridge or across the next river. Maybe it's right here, in a town called Wood River, with a school teacher who's brave enough to stand up to the Wilkins brothers." Fiona's breath caught. "What are you saying, Xavier?" "I'm saying I'd like to accept your father's offer. Stay in Wood River, see where this," he gestured between them, "might lead." Joy spread through Fiona's chest like wildfire. "I'd like that too." Xavier's hand found hers on the swing between them, his calloused fingers entwining with her smaller ones. "I can't promise it will be easy. I've lived a solitary life for a long time, and I have enemies." "I'm not asking for easy," Fiona replied. "Just real." In the fading light, Xavier's face softened. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Fiona met him halfway, their lips touching in a gentle kiss that held both promise and question. When they parted, Xavier smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire countenance. "I should speak with your father." "He's in his study," Fiona said, reluctantly releasing his hand. "Shall I tell him you're here, please?" As Fiona rose to fetch her father, Xavier caught her wrist lightly. "Fiona." "Yes. Thank you for showing me what's worth staying for." The following weeks unfolded like a dream for Fiona. Xavier formally accepted George's business proposition and began learning the intricacies of the mercantile trade. Though he initially stayed at the hotel propriety demanded it, once his status shifted from guest to suitor, he spent most evenings with the Vaughn family. Wood River citizens gradually accepted him, especially after the Wilkins brothers were sentenced to prison terms for their attack. Henry Blackwell, to his credit, offered Xavier a cordial handshake and best wishes before departing for banking school in Chicago. By Christmas, with snow blanketing the prairie and festive decorations adorning the town, Xavier had become an integral part of Wood River society. His business acumen helped George expand the store's inventory, attracting customers from neighboring settlements. His knowledge of horses made him a valued advisor to local ranchers, and his Sunday appearances in church beside Fiona silenced even the most persistent gossips. On Christmas Eve, after the candlelight service at church, Xavier asked Fiona to walk with him despite the cold. They strolled through the quiet town, their breath forming clouds in the frosty air. "You remember what you asked me that first day? Whether I'd miss stability, family, a place to belong." Xavier said as they stopped on the bridge over the frozen river. I remember. I didn't know then what I was missing. He turned to her, taking both her hands in his. I do now. From his pocket he withdrew a small box. Inside nestled a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl. It was my mother's, he explained. One of the few things I've carried with me all these years. Xavier knelt in the snow. Fiona Elizabeth Vaughn, will you marry me? Tears of joy froze on her cheeks as she nodded. Yes, Xavier. Yes, I will. They were married in the spring of 1875 when the prairie bloomed with wildflowers. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which featured not only traditional wedding customs, but also elements of Pawnee ceremony that honored Xavier's maternal heritage. George gifted them land on the edge of town, where Xavier built a sturdy house with his own hands. Above the fireplace hung his knife and the bear's paw, reminders of the moment that had brought them together. In the autumn of that year, Xavier opened the second Vaughn and Jameson General Store in Grand Island, making the trip twice weekly to oversee operations. His reputation as a fair businessman who stood for no nonsense spread throughout the region, bringing prosperity to both locations. Fiona continued teaching until the birth of their first child in 1876, a son they named George after her father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed in 1878, and another son, William, in 1881. The bear attack that had once threatened Fiona's life became a story told and retold to their children and eventually their grandchildren. How fate had placed Xavier on that particular trail at that precise moment. How courage and a well-honed knife had stood between death and a future that neither could have imagined. In 1899, when Wood River celebrated its 25th anniversary as an incorporated town, Xavier and Fiona were honored as leading citizens. Standing before their friends and neighbors, their children grown and beginning families of their own, Xavier squeezed his wife's hand. Every mile I traveled before Wood River was leading me here, he said in a rare public speech. To this town, to this woman, to this life. Later that night, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the stars emerge, Fiona rested her head on the shoulder of the man who had stepped between her and a charging bear all those years ago. Any regrets, she asked, as she sometimes did, about staying? Xavier's arm tightened around her. Not one, he answered as he always did. Not ever. And as the moon rose over Wood River, casting silver light across the land they both called home, Fiona knew it was true. Their love, born in a moment of danger and nurtured through years of joy and sorrow, had given the wandering cowboy roots deeper than any he could have imagined. And it had given her a life richer and more adventurous than any she could have dreamed, without ever leaving the town she loved. All because a bear had charged at her in the woods, and a cowboy had stepped between them with his knife.